Those of you who don't know me, my name is Manny. I'm one of the pastors here at Alethia. And I always love coming and bringing the Word. The good news is, it's not my words, it's the Lord's Word, right? Amen? All right, that's what we're going to be praying about this morning. And so if you just join me in prayer, then we'll get going, okay? Heavenly Father, man, we love you. We thank you that we can come together and celebrate what you did through your Son on the cross for us. Father, I pray that this morning you would transform us, you'd renew our minds, encourage us, give us hope. Also, Lord, I pray for those that need to hear some hard truth this morning, that you would just cut straight to their heart and break down those walls so they can grow closer to you, so that we can be in relationship with you. And so, Father, we just pray that this morning, and we pray for a good time. In your name, amen. All right, so go ahead and flip over to 1 Samuel chapter 21. So before we get completely started, last week Paul taught from 19 and 20, where King Saul of Israel, was going after David, kind of losing his mind, plotting a way to kill him. And then there's another chapter that we talked about Jonathan, Saul's son, warning David about this encounter that's about to happen, and basically saying, you need to run, you need to get out of here before my dad kills you, which is a pretty crazy story in itself. But what it really comes down to is that Jonathan knew what was right, and he knew that he needed to be obedient to what the Lord was doing, and so out of his love that the Lord had called him to, he needed to tell David in obedience. If you think about that, right? Think of a son. If you were a son to your dad, and your dad wanted to get some vengeance on somebody, and walking in that obedience could be pretty tough. That he was doing that, and what Paul had kind of alluded to, which is true, was the gospel, the good news of God's love towards us. And the reason why Jonathan loved David was because God first loved us. Out of 1 John 4:18, we love because he first loved us. And it's a great picture, again, of the gospel. We're going to see more of how Saul is losing his mind in chapter 22, and so we'll get there. But I'm really excited to get to share with you the first part and how David is going to be a good example of what it means to deal with some certain problems and how we should deal with it. And so who in here has problems? Raise your hand. No shame, okay? We all have problems, right? Actually, Mace talked about no money, no problems, right? I love that song. That was one of my favorite songs growing up. But the more problems, or the more money we have, the more problems we find. And it's not just about money, but it seems like the more we live, the more we're going to encounter problems. And here's the deal. The Lord knows that we're going to do that. That's actually, we can take that to the bank, that we're going to experience some trials, tribulations, and problems. And so David actually gives us a really good example on how we can deal with those. And so let's go ahead and jump into 1 Samuel chapter 21. Then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came to meet David trembling and said to him, "Why are you alone? And no one is with you." And David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has charged me with a matter, and said to me, 'Let no one know anything of the matter about which I sent you, and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever is here.' And the priest answered David, 'I have no common bread on hand, but there is the holy bread. If the young men have kept themselves from women, if the young men have kept themselves from women.' And David answered the priest, 'Truly, women have been kept from us, as always when I go on the expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy?' So the priest gave them the holy bread, for there was no bread there, but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord, to be replaced by hot bread on the day it is taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen." So we're going to stop there, okay? So we're going to really focus on the first few verses, okay, on that. So what's happening is David is fleeing, okay? He listened to Jonathan's advice, and he fled. And so he runs to a temple where Ahimelech is at, and he's dealing with this problem. Now, Ahimelech is obviously very concerned because he's actually never met David before. At least that's the understanding, is he's never met David before, but he understands who David is and why is he alone. And actually, David's not really alone, but he's not. A guy like David really shouldn't be there. That's really what it comes down to. And so Ahimelech is really concerned, and David actually lies about it because he doesn't want Ahimelech to be found guilty of the things that he's participating in. So he doesn't want him to have any association because he knows that Saul is going a little crazy. Okay, but this is the thing that we get to look at, and we're just going to look at these verses to start with, and we'll come back and we'll read it in. Okay, so when David is dealing with this problem, he knows that Saul is coming after him, and he's dealing with this problem. Now, we all have problems, right? And we all deal with problems in different ways, okay? But typically, there's two things that we have to deal with when we have problems or we go through trials. And I'm not a counselor, so I'm not going to proclaim that I'm some professional, and so Rob may need to correct me after this. But here's two things I can tell you and that I think we're all confident in, right? There are certain problems that we can't control, and there are certain problems that we can at least take action in or that we can control. Okay? So let's just remember those two things. There's no, scientific therapist words that I can use other than saying there's certain things we can control and we can't control. In this situation, David can't control that Saul is going mad and going after him, right? But David can control what he does with that in himself and how he takes action, okay? So here, David is teaching us how to deal with the things that we can't control, and we're going to learn how to tackle those things that we can control. And so, as you look at verse 1, it says, "So then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech, the priest, and Ahimelech came to meet David." Okay? So the first thing, when he ran into some problems, he is symbolically actually running to God. He runs to the temple. Okay? He runs to the house of the Lord. All right? So most of the time, we don't do that. We don't run to the house of the Lord. We run in fear. We maybe run away. We don't take care of the things we need to take care of. And it sounds simple, but this is where most of us will land, right? We say, maybe this is the last resort. Has it really got to this that I need to pray? That I need to come before God? That I need to run to someone that can give me wise counsel? Usually, that's kind of the last thing that comes to our mind. And so David right here is sharing a good example of how we can actually go to God first. Now it's a simple sentence, right? He came to Nob, to Ahimelech, the priest, and this is where the temple is at. But again, a lot of us will say, I'm not going to pray yet, I don't need to bring it to God yet, and it really should be the first thing we do. Really actually should be so natural that anything, good or bad situations, we should be seeking God. Right? And so David is naturally doing that because he's a man after God's own heart. And so we got to take care of the spiritual first. But here's what Satan likes to do. There's some certain things that we probably couldn't nail down. But what Satan likes to do and put us in this trap is that we procrastinate. Right? We procrastinate. Now, procrastination is basically an active way of avoidance. Now, when I was growing up, as a teenager, I thought it was really cool that I could procrastinate and then get like an A on a test. That's pretty cool. Or that I could, avoid certain things and then get away with it and fly by the seat of my pants. Any of you in here that do that? Yeah, we all do that, right? But we can get trapped in this lie that that's actually the right thing. Procrastination is really just an avoidance technique where we don't want to deal with our own issues or our own problems, okay? It's not as cool as what I thought it was. Someone open up their Bibles to James 4:17 and read that. James 4:17. Okay. So whoever knows the right things to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. All right. So this is the problem with something like avoidance or procrastination, is that we basically are committing sin by omission, and that's what they're talking about in James. And so this is why it's important to maybe heed some things from David when he is taking this on. Taking on your problems is actually a sign of spiritual maturity. And, when we decide to avoid, that's a sign of immaturity. When I'm taking care of my kids and I need to discipline one of my kids and they've done something wrong, they want to avoid the situation. They want to make up excuses for why they can't do this, or they didn't know that was a rule, even though I've told them that a million times. That they are trying to avoid something. And so I, as a father, I can't let them just avoid it. And we can't avoid those problems in the same way. It's adolescence, right? And so we can't sit there and do nothing because it's going to be more painful in the end. And so this is what David is doing, taking that on. All right, so as we go on, right, he's talking to Ahimelech, and you'll notice it kind of changes really quick. He tells Ahimelech, what's going on, lies to him. And then he says, now then, what, and this is verse 3, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever is here, okay? And so the first thing we do when we experience problems is that we need to go to God, all right? But the next thing, you'll notice Ahimelech says, and the prince answered David, I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread. If the young men have kept themselves from women, then they can have it. And so what David is about to say is that's fine. And so what David is doing is he is accepting God's provision for him. All right? And so David gives a good example of what it means to accept God's provision. He could have easily said, man, life isn't fair. I just went and I slayed Goliath, and everyone was thinking about me, and now I'm getting persecuted and pursued. Life isn't fair. Instead of complaining, he says, all right, I can accept that provision that God is giving me through Ahimelech, right? So too often, we like to take a stance of maybe saying, that's not good enough for me. That's not exactly how I want to deal with the situation. That's not exactly where I think you should take it, God. And what we're doing, though, is we're basically saying that the way I feel is more important than the way that God is expressing his love to me and what he's put in front of me. And so when David is dealing through this, imagine being chased and persecuted. Your best friend tells you that his dad's going to kill you, and he could be whining about a lot of things. But instead he says, man, that sounds really good. I'm going to accept that. And so let's go back here, though, to that verse 3 through 6. When they're talking about the holy bread, they actually are talking about the bread of the presence, right? Bread, some people call it the show bread or the holy bread. If you want to hear about show bread, go to Joe Landry. He'll tell you about this awesome band that you'll be like, man, that's interesting, okay? But show bread was something that occurred when they were treating the Levitical law in Exodus and Leviticus. As something that was symbolic of God's presence before his people. All right, and so what it looked like was literally this altar with basically 2 stacks of 6 pieces of bread under each other. It kind of looked like, to me, when I was looking at the pictures, it looked like donuts that were just stacked on top of each other. But what it represented was the 12 tribes of Israel, and it was something that only the Levitical priests could consume at the end of the day. Okay, it was the only thing that no one else could consume that. So if I were, an Israelite and I was coming in, it's not something I could eat. Only those that were Levites in the priesthood. Okay, and so that bread signifies that God was meeting people face to face when they would come to the tabernacle, and through that Levitical law. And now, so David actually, has to justify that him and his men are holy. Which they are. Basically, he's making an argument saying, look, man, we've been chased for a little while now. We don't have time for ladies, okay? If you were being persecuted, you may not have time for ladies either. And so he's justifying that. And he said, besides that, if I could, we wouldn't, because we're up sitting and we're righteous before the Lord. But, Ahimelech is doing his due diligence, which is really great. Sorry. I'm just going to throw Paul under the bus. His head was so big that it's just not staying on. All right. But here's the deal, right? So that, when I talk about the show bread, again, there's a symbolic reverence about who God is. And Ahimelech has a choice here, which I think is really fascinating, because he has a choice to say, sorry, man, I can't give you this bread, I can't feed you and your soldiers, I can't feed you and your men, because it would go against the law. But this is where you start to see the sweet message from God, that God's mercy and love extends over the law. That he extends mercy over these rules and starts to break that down. Someone open up to Luke 6, 3 through 5. As you're opening up, go ahead and open. But technically, this is not a suitable meal for someone like David. Really, he shouldn't be allowed to touch it. Him and his men shouldn't. So is someone there? 3 through 5.
And Jesus answered them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those with him. And he said to them, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath.
Right. Okay, so in this story, right, so, if you went, years on, Jesus is with his disciples, and the Pharisees are actually, basically calling Jesus out about him and his disciples coming in and eating things unclean, or not washing their hands. And Jesus comes back to this as an example of saying, hey, look, I get what you were trying to do here, but that's not what it's about anymore. It's not about the law. It's not about, us trying to hold this order when God has a different plan. And so he's using that. And so it's a really cool illustration of how the Lord is extending mercy. And even in the Old Testament, right, it's all over the place, but we kind of have this misconception or perception of the Old Testament being this mean-spirited God, and then somehow we get to the New Testament. They don't change, okay? But we like to perceive that way. We like to make it like that. And so Jesus is talking about how God's mercy extends over this. And actually, J.D. Greer, who's a pretty great pastor out in North Carolina, wrote in a book, he says, the reason why this illustration or this story matters to you and me is because we can see that Jesus provides all that we need. He is our Lord of provision, okay? He's the Lord of provision, and he cares about us, and he's always shown that since the beginning of time, okay? And so sometimes we say, okay, I'm going to separate God over here in the Old Testament. I'm going to separate God over here, and I'm only going to listen to the things he has to say in the New, because that's what our culture is somehow doing. And so there's some really sweet parts that come from that when we're looking through the lens of what David is experiencing. And so David, if you haven't got this already, David is a type of Christ in illustrating, his anointing that one day will be Jesus. Okay, so there's a lot of things that we can identify with, and this is one of those through that story of the show Bread. Okay, and so when J.D. is talking about that, this is when the Lord starts making the relationship with him personal. When we can come to him and say, okay, Lord, I know that you stretch way beyond these rules and this law that we're supposed to abide by. And I think we get caught in that far too often. That's why the Pharisees, sometimes we say, dang, I think like a Pharisee. Or I treat people like a Pharisee. In something where Jesus kind of calls them out. Really helps in that. And so, as we're looking at it, right, I was talking about how we take a stance where we say, God, your provision is not enough. Think about it for you. If you've gone through a trial, maybe you're in a trial right now. Maybe you've gotten out of a trial, or you're starting to get in one. You can just feel it. Okay? We unfortunately take a posture of protest. We take a posture saying, God, this isn't good enough. He has it right here. And you say, nope, I don't want it. I don't want what you have before me. And the problem with that, though, is when we say that's not enough, we basically make ourselves God over the one that's providing for us. And when we take that posture, I'll say it this way, right, is that when we take that posture and we take it all the time, if we frequently do it, I understand sometimes we aren't satisfied, we're not happy to have to deal with these things because some of these things are painful, and some of these things are out of our control, and some of these problems are within our control. But when we start to make our posture of just saying it's not good enough, that becomes our identity. More often than not, we identify with just not being happy, not finding contentment. Okay? And so one thing that happens in that, and you'll notice also through Saul, what's happening to Saul, man? His kingship, he knows it's going down in flames. So what's happening to him? He's protecting it. Someone was saying something over here. Bitterness? Bitterness? Okay, sweet. So, he's becoming bitter. He's becoming twisted. He's trying to protect something that the Lord is saying, this isn't yours anymore. It's not yours. And Saul is finding some discontentment, right? And so what we need to do is we need to really think about and check our hearts and say, do I take a posture of discontentment? Or do I look at the Lord and say, man, I really want to find his provision for me in my life? And there's a million different stories, a million different examples that we could look at when we struggle through that. But everyone flip over, everybody, go to Philippians 4, 12 through 13. I don't know why I grabbed that Bible. Philippians 4, 12 through 13. Now, most of you are familiar with this verse because Tim Tebow had it under his eye for a good few years, right? No one likes Tim Tebow anymore. Interesting. Sorry, Timmy. So Philippians 4 through 12, or 4:12 through 13. Someone read that.
I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength.
So, unfortunately, our society, and I don't blame Tim Tebow, but we take this verse and we just basically throw it out there and say, you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you, which is true. But if you look at verse 12, he's saying, I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound in any and every circumstance. I have learned the secret of facing plenty, hunger, abundance, and need. This is what's going on, right? Is that he's saying, I know how to find contentment. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Okay, so I'm sorry to maybe burst someone's bubble, but when you pump up your kid and you tell them you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you, it's got to be reasoned within contentment, not them trying to find contentment because they have the strength, right? And so when we're looking at that, and then in verse 19, he kind of throws this promise out there through God's word. So he's saying, I can do all things through God who strengthens me because I'm content. In verse 19, he says, and my God will supply every need of yours according to his riches in glory in Jesus Christ. Right? And so he's saying, there's a conditional statement saying, you can only find contentment in Christ. And David knew that's what was going on when he went and talked to Ahimelech to help him and get through those things. Now, one thing I think is important to know, don't confuse someone telling you to be content, that when you're frustrated and you're sad, that doesn't mean the Lord doesn't want you to grieve through his answer. Okay? He allows us to grieve those things. I can't just sit up here and say, well, you're wrong for being unhappy. Okay? He understands that. He sympathizes with us. And David definitely grieved a lot of different things. If you go in the Psalms, man, he is grieving things all the time. Sometimes you're like, man, I think the Lord gets it when he said it in verse 1 and he said it in verse 121, right? And so he says those things a lot, but it also gives us freedom to grieve. And I think actually you find more freedom in grieving when you start to learn contentment. But don't feel bad when you're frustrated about those things. But we learn those things from David. Now let's go back to verse 7 of 1 Samuel 21. So we talked about the showbread. The priest gave him the showbread. And now we're in verse 7. It says, now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg, the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. Now, some of us may be familiar with an Edomite, but basically the city of Edom was not a cool place. You don't deal with them. Israel knew that they were not people you should deal with. They've been really jacking with them since the beginning of time when they were in the wilderness. And so we all know that the Edomites are bad. And so there's some foreshadowing here of what's going on. And also Doeg is part of Saul's force. And so that kind of makes it interesting too. Verse 8, then David said to Ahimelech, then have you not here a spear or a sword at hand? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapon with me, because the king's business required haste. And the priest said, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine whom you struck down in the valley, is here. Behold, it is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is none but that here. And David said, there is none like that, give it to me. That's pretty crazy, right? So David is hanging out in this place. I don't think he knew that Goliath's sword was there, but he took it, and now he's taking it with him, which just finds it interesting. Now here is something that's interesting. So David makes two really good decisions, okay? First, he goes and he seeks the Lord for counsel. And then second, he is appreciative and sees the Lord's provision through this bread. But all of a sudden, he gets wrapped up, and he's about to make a very, very poor decision. And you'll see here in verse 10, and David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, is not this David the king of the land? Did they sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. I know that why Saul is so sad, because basically David's way cooler and way more awesome, right? But what David is doing, he's making a very impulsive decision. And I think some of us can get caught in that. I'm a pretty impulsive type person. And then we have people that maybe think through, for the millionth time, a calculation that they made on their spreadsheet. And so there's really bad ways to handle either way, right? And so I'm on the opposite side. I'm a lot like David, and I just jump into things. And so David, for some reason, flees down to Gath, and he really shouldn't have done that. And here's why. Verse 12, and David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands and made marks on the doors of the gate and let his spittle run down his beard. So basically, he drooled down his beard and looked crazy. Then Achish said to his servants, behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? So, again, we've talked a little bit about how these different nations kind of, if they're not following God, basically they're really superstitious. And so David uses that to his advantage. He makes a really poor decision, runs down to Gath, and is about to get captured, and then he acts like a madman. And so maybe that's something we should use as a tactic, is drool all over ourselves and look insane, right? But we probably wouldn't get away with that. But back then, really these kings didn't want anything to do with it because they felt like they were either possessed or they just didn't want to deal with the trouble. And so David gets himself out of it, but he made a really poor mistake in that time by going down to Gath. Now we go to chapter 22. David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him, and he became commander over them. And there were with him about 400 men. So the first question I had was, how do 400 people fit in a cave? Okay, but this was actually a pretty big cave, and people were reporting to David. But one thing to make note of, they were the outcasts. They were the ones that were being persecuted because they were searching after something that was right. So when we talk about going through trials, we're going to go through them because we're trying to seek the Lord's righteousness. We're trying to go after that. Again, it says that they were distressed. Everyone was in debt. Everyone was bitter in soul because they knew what Saul was doing, right? So these people came back to David in his camp, and were really trying to take care of him. Actually, in Hebrews 13, 12 through 13, it says, so Jesus suffered on the outside of the gates. So when he was being crucified, he suffered on the outside as well. And for us, when we follow Christ, when we say, man, God, I'm going to follow you, I'm going to abandon everything, we're going to suffer. And again, not in a demented way, but in a way that we feel persecution, we feel the pressure, and we feel like we might crumble. So verse 3 of 22 says, and David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and my mother stay with you, till I know what God will do for me. And he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. Then the prophet Gad said to David, do not remain in the stronghold. Depart and go into the land of Judah. So David departed and went to the forest of Hereth. So what's going on there? So David brings his family. Like everyone followed him, right? But including his family. And he's asking them to take care of it. And those people actually kind of see, hey, you don't want this to happen. Like, because if they come here, some bad things are going to come upon us. And so that David heeds that advice. And they keep going. And then, so this is where Saul really kind of gets a little out of whack, even more. And so, verse 6, now Saul heard that David was discovered, and the men who were with him. Saul was sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height, with his spear in his hand, and all the servants were standing about him. And Saul said to his servants who stood about him, hear now, people of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of the thousands and commanders of hundreds, that all of you have conspired against me? No one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. So you notice here, Saul's a little mad. He's a little salty, right? He's a little upset because basically, his son has already showed his allegiance. And his son didn't show allegiance necessarily to David. I would make the claim that he made allegiance to God, therefore he was taking care of the one the Lord had sent, right? And so, but he actually says he can't even call David by his name anymore. He just keeps on calling him by the son of Jesse. That's how ticked off Saul is. He can't say his name. He's pretty bitter. And then, so they all conspired against me. Verse 9. Then, what am I doing here? Verse 8. Let's go there, okay? That all of you have conspired against me. No one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me, or discloses so to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who stood by the servants of Saul, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And they inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So Doeg comes in here. We talked about him for a second. He's not a cool dude. He really breaks our heart, and he basically is the snitch everyone knows in these movies where bad guys do bad things. Okay, and so this is a really sad and sobering story that we're about to read, and I think it's something to look at how David responds. Verse 11 says, Then the king sent to summon Ahimelech, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house. The priests who were at Nob, and all of them came to the king. And Saul said, Hear now, son of Ahitub. And he answered, Here I am, my lord. And Saul said to him, Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he has risen against me to lie in wait at this day? Then Ahimelech answered the king, And who among all your servants is so faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law and captain over your bodyguard and honored in your house? Verse 15, Is today the first time that I have inquired of God for him? No, let not the king impute anything to his servant or to all the house of my father, for your servant has known nothing of all this, much or little. And the king said, You shall surely die, Ahimelech, and you and all your father's house. And the king said to the guard who stood about him, Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David. And they knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me. But the servants of the king would not put out their hand to strike the priests of the Lord. Then the king said to Doeg, you turn and strike the priest. And Doeg the Edomite turned and struck down the priest, and he killed on that day 85 persons who wore the linen ephod. Whoa, right? So here we are. David is doing some pretty, gnarly stuff. He's fleeing. He's going to God. He sees his provision. People are coming and following him, and he's encouraged by it, and he's excited about it. And then all of a sudden, his actions, by going to the temple, gets Ahimelech and his priests killed. That's a tough pill to swallow, right? And I think one thing that can be difficult is, was David being punished for it, or was it because of Saul? And really, at the end of the day, there's no such thing as evil outside in this world, right? There's evil out in this world. If you don't read this and you say, man, that's just awful. I mean, this is literally genocide, right? It happening in this time. And we go through that stuff quite often. We see those things happening in our society. We see those things happening around the world. And it's very easy to point the finger at God. But in all reality, Saul is the one that's being blinded by his own convictions, which are really bad, right? So he's being blinded and doing evil things before the Lord. Verse 19, and Nob, the city of the priests, he put to the sword, both man and women, child, infant, ox, donkey, and sheep, he put to the sword. So he kept killing more of them. But one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priest of the Lord. And David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul. So this even went through David's mind, right? He caught that guy's eye and said, I don't like that. And so he sees it, he acknowledges it. That he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all persons of your father's house. Now read verse 23, sorry. And it says this, stay with me and do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. With me you shall be in safekeeping. So here's what's going on, right? Is the Lord is making more and more evident that David is the anointed one. The one that is going to bring protection. And I was talking about how when we follow the righteous path, we're going to face persecution. We're going to face hardships. And the Lord, is obviously bringing us to a very evident point for David, who hasn't even really obtained the kingdom yet, right? But the Lord is making it evident that this is my anointed one for the line of Jesus. And if we go back to Hebrews 13:12-13, it says, so Jesus also suffered on the outside of the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. And it says, therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. Why do we do that, right? For here we have no lasting city, but we see the city that is to come. In Hebrews, it's talking about how we're outcasts. People that live inside the city, they look through a different lens, but we look at righteousness, and so does David. And we all know that we go through stuff, or really tough things. We know we endure, or we need to endure a lot. And here is David bringing some comfort because he's a type of Christ. And I think for us, right, we struggle because we take that posture of, this isn't good enough for me. I don't see the Lord's provision, but usually it's right under our nose. Usually it's right before us. And so as David goes through kind of a cycle, right, he meets Ahimelech. Ahimelech hooks him up with some bread. The Lord shows his mercy over the law, and then he goes and people get, killed because of his actions. And it's easy for us to put ourselves in a situation where we feel like our actions, even when we act righteously, are somehow consequences for pursuing righteousness. And what this story is telling us here is that really the world is the one to blame. We're fleshly people. We're the ones that kind of walked in that sin. This passage actually reminds us that the scriptures don't present the best world or the ideal world, but actually a real world. And we should be comforted by that, actually. Because if we were in some utopian state, we wouldn't be able to actually surrender ourselves to God. We wouldn't be able to go to him in confidence. Again, this is where David kind of makes that, portrayal. Now, everybody turn your Bibles to Romans 8:35. So when we go through trials, we go through hardships, we go through problems, you need to know that the Lord hears us when we bring them to him. And sometimes we can even come to him with a discontent heart, and we know that he's going to just slap us aside and say, wait, this isn't how I want you to handle it. So don't hear me and think, well, Manny's saying I have to be content first. No, I think that sometimes we come to God and he makes us content. He shows us what it means to be content. But there's a promise that he has for us. It says in Romans 8:35, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As is written, for your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. I don't know about you, but that doesn't always sound like fun. But David again shows us a good example of what it means to bring our lives before the Lord. Verse 37. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. And so it's saying, who shall separate us from the love of God? Is it these things? Is it this trial? Is it this problem? In Paul, when he's writing this, says, no, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor heights, nor depths, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God. And so when David is saying, hey, follow me, stay with me, I'll keep you safe. He's portraying what God's love is for us. And so I'm going to actually invite the band up here, but if you want to come up, it'd be awesome. But when we look at that, and we look at the trials in our life, or the problems, or the things that upset us, do you take a posture of discontentment? Do you take a heart of, God, whatever you bring, I'm just not even open? And that can be really hard for some of us. I know it's hard for me sometimes when I say, man, I want something to be done my way. And I know for David, he definitely wanted things to happen in a different way. And it would be really easy to kind of point our finger and say, look what you did, God, because of my obedience, now all these people are dead. But in all reality, we live in a fallen world. We live in a place that is really tough. And so sometimes we need to lean into the promise that God has for us. That he has for you. Who should separate us from the love of Christ? Is it tribulations? Is it distress? Is it persecution? Or is it famine? Or for we live now, right? But is it because we lack money? We lack status? Something didn't come in time? No. In all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. No one one can replace what Christ did for us on the cross. What he did for you on the cross. He already gave that up. Right? God already sent his son to die for us. And so, therefore, we get to be more than conquerors. Because he'll protect us. And when we read David, I'm really excited for the things to come, because you'll notice this trial that David goes through, where he makes good decision and poor decision and good decision and poor decision, and you'll probably be able to relate, and you'll say, man, I'm just like that. But one thing that we can all relate with, and even with David, is when we are in the midst of that fire, in the midst of that trial, God is saying, man, I have you. He didn't do that in vain, right? Christ didn't die so that we could be miserable or forever, or, and so that's where we're working out this contentment piece and working out this trust piece. What is it? It's faith. It's walking in faith that Christ died for us, died for you and for your sins. So as we go into worship, we are actually going to do a few things a little bit different when it comes to communion time. We're actually going to take communion together. So I'll be coming back talking about that. But let's just take a minute and pause and bring that before the Lord and say, man, Lord, where am I finding discontentment? Where am I finding myself that I just need to surrender things to you? Heavenly Father, I just pray for us here today that we would seek you, that we would take a posture like David in coming to before you in prayer and through people. And God, that if anyone here has a stance of discontentment, that God, that you would work on their heart this morning. That they would find it in their will just to come to you and say, God, like, I need to surrender this to you. Lord, I pray for those that come here that are weary, God, and just bearing something that they can't hold anymore, God. I pray that this morning that they would have an opportunity to bring that before you. We pray these things in your name.